Hello again and welcome to another edition of Newsmaker of the Week, brought to you by the SCV Press Club and Time Warner Cable and hosted by the Signal newspaper. I'm Leon Warden and we have come out here to Congregation Beth Shalom to share in a very special evening with someone who is no stranger to the camera, Mr. Leonard Nimoy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You have a new book, Shekhina. Tell us about it.
Well, the book has been out for a while, actually. It's a book that deals with, it's a photographic study on the subject of the feminine aspect of God. Several years ago, a rabbi educated me to the idea that Jewish mythology tells us that God created a feminine aspect of himself, split off a feminine aspect of himself to live amongst humans. And the idea intrigued me. I've been involved with photography for many, many years, ever since I was a teenager. And I've been working on images of female figure. I became intrigued with the idea of exploring the possibility of finding this ways of expressing this in photographic imagery, the idea of this feminine deity, that supposedly exudes a lot of light, compassion, sensitivity, intercedes between humans and God when necessary, and that's essentially what motivated the book.
Now, the lady on the cover and in many of the photos is wearing nothing more than some of these vestments that are typically worn by men.
Right.
How did you come to express her and the idea of her that way?
You know, it may be surprising to some people, but not necessarily to everybody, that the religion and the literature of the religion carries an awful lot of sensuality in it. There are numerous stories that have to do with the sexuality and sensuality of the historical figures. I decided to not shy away from it and not portray this figure as some misty figure in clouds somewhere. I decided to make her a flesh and blood being who could appear or disappear if she chose to, but who, if she appeared, would be physical, would be actual physical feminine figure. And it's created some degree of intense conversation in some communities, some quarters. But by and large, the reception has been very positive. A lot of people are intrigued, want to know what this is all about. They have maybe if they have some Jewish background, they maybe have some sense of the history of the idea, but have never been confronted with this physical reality that I've given her. And you're right, the talit, the prayer shawl that she wears, and the phylacteries that she wears bound to her arm are typically worn by Jewish males. So there's a certain kind of transgression going on. I figure this is if this is a deity, if this is a holy power figure, and I think she is, she can wear whatever she wants. And who am I to say, you can't wear that? You know?
In your mind, is she what the allegorical figure looks like?
Yeah, exactly. I was showing this work some time ago at an artist retreat. A number of artists who were working in Jewish territories, creating Jewish crafts, creating Jewish art and so forth. And one fellow said to me, your Shekhina doesn't look anything like my Shekhina. And I said, what does your Shekhina look like? He said, mine looks more like my bubby, my grandmother. And I said, well, everybody's entitled to their own Shekhina. You have yours and I have mine. He said, you're a very lucky guy.
And yours is available where?
She's in the book.
Where do people get a hold of the book?
Probably in some bookstores or some art bookstores, but it's available on Amazon.com.
Okay. Yeah. Now, you said there's been some, interesting reaction to it. And you've come out here to Congregation Beth Shalom, which is a conservative congregation. Yeah. I guess we'll find out when you make your formal presentation in a few moments, but how is it received? I mean, how do you think Rabbi Steve Kahn's congregation received it?
I'm curious. I don't know the answer to that question. I'll let you know in a couple hours.
Okay.
I've had a very wide range of responses, everything from a welcoming and excited response in a positive kind of way to a total censorship rejection. I've had, in a couple of cases, a couple of congregations where I was initially invited to come and speak. When they saw the book and saw the images, said, no, don't come. Don't bring those pictures here. So I wouldn't be surprised by whatever the reception is. Most important is that the ideas that this book engenders, and the conversation that it engenders, is exciting and interesting to me. It's stimulating, and I think it's stimulating to a lot of other people as well.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. What kind of emotion or reaction do you want people to, come away with when they look at the photographs?
I want people to be enlightened in some way, to learn something that perhaps they didn't know before. I want them to be moved in some way that perhaps that might surprise them. The subject matter moved me when I began to explore it. I say in the book that making these images was a very spiritual, interesting experience for me. That it brought me closer to a spirituality that I had that surprised me. I'd like people to think that it's a worthwhile piece of work. It is also, by the way, it is a work of art, and therefore should be stimulating in some way. If it's not stimulating in some way, then it's simply decorative and pretty.
Right.
These images, some people think they're pretty, and I would probably agree with most of that, but they're not intended to be just simply decoration. They're intended to be thought-provoking.
Okay.
Yeah.
How long have you been interested in this spirituality or mysticism?
Well, the origins of the idea for the book came to me about 8 or 9 years ago in a conversation with our rabbi, my family rabbi in Los Angeles. He was the first one who introduced me to the idea of the Shekhina, the feminine aspect of God, and that there's a point in the service, Jewish service, where the mythology tells us that Shekhina comes into the sanctuary to bless the congregation. And I remember as a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, in an Orthodox service, at a certain point in the service, my father said to me, "Don't look." And everybody's got their eyes covered and they've got their prayer shawls over their head. And I never understood why. And this rabbi explained that the mythology tells us that that's the moment when the Shekhina comes into the sanctuary. And the congregation protects themselves from this awesome light that might hurt you by covering your eyes or closing your eyes. And that's why you don't look. So when I heard that, when he told me that, I began to wonder what it might be like to try to visualize this, to try to capture it with a camera.
Where were you 8 or 9 years old?
Boston.
Okay. Yeah. And were your parents religious people?
They were observant. We lived 3 generations in an apartment with my grandparents, my parents, and my brother and I. And I would say the observant people were my grandparents. And we lived in a kosher environment. My parents kept separate dishes, separate cutlery and so forth for the meat and for the dairy and so forth. But we weren't a family that were what I would call devout, who went very often every week or whatever to a synagogue, but went on the holidays and so forth.
How does an 8 or 9 year old kid who's inspired and interested in this aspect of the Jewish spirituality end up coming to Hollywood and at about what, age 20 or so? I mean, isn't that all full of heathens and sinners?
Well, around the same time that I became interested in photography, I also I was very lucky. I lived in a neighborhood that was very cultural. Boston still is a very kind of thriving city in terms of culture. A lot of theater, a lot of dance, a lot of music, and the neighborhood that I lived in had a wonderful little theater in what was known as a settlement house, a place where kids could go after school and you could be involved in a science program or an athletics program, and there was a theater program. And one day somebody said to me, "Go and see those people in that room down there." And I walked in, and I was 8 years old, and I walked in, and they said, "Sing us God Bless America" or something, and I did. And the next thing I knew, I was Hansel in a production of Hansel and Gretel. And that's how the whole thing started. So I continued acting there until I was in my late teens, and then I decided this was what I wanted to do with my life.
Okay. You came out to Hollywood, and I guess at some point you were under contract with the Republic.
With what?
With Republic?
No, not exactly. I did some work at Republic. It wasn't a contract. I was a freelance actor for a number of years. So I worked at Republic, I worked at Universal, I worked at MGM, I worked at all the studios. But I did do some work at Republic in the very early years. I did westerns for them and science fiction shows for them, early 1950s.
Yeah.
How did you know that?
I watched the, just a little bit of reading about your background, but I was watching the Encore Westerns channel the other night and I saw you in a cowboy hat. And I don't
At Republic, they used me as an Indian.
As an Indian?
I played Indians in Republic movies.
Okay.
There was a series of films with an actor named Rex Allen, and his buddy in those movies was an actor named Slim Pickens, and they needed somebody like me to play the bad guy. That was me. You know.
That was you.
I rode horses and wore a wig. That's what I remember about it.
Well, what I couldn't tell from that movie. I don't remember which one it was, but I couldn't tell whether that was shot at maybe Republic Studio in Studio City, or if it was out here at Melody Ranch. What's your earliest memory of the Newhall Saugus area as it used to be?
I remember working at Vasquez Rocks a number of times. And the last time that I was involved in something at Vasquez Rocks was some footage that we shot for Star Trek IV, movie I directed. If I remember correctly, there's a shot of me as Spock on top of one of the rocky areas. And maybe some other footage I don't recall at the moment. But Vasquez Rocks was very useful because it did have that desolate kind of uncivilized look.
Had you used it in westerns?
Have I used it in westerns? I never directed any westerns.
No. I mean, have you appeared in any westerns in which it was used?
Oh yeah.
Were you back in the 50s and 60s when you were doing westerns?
I was in all the western TV shows. I was in Wagon Train and Rawhide and oh golly, you name it, I was there. I can't remember all the names, but I must have appeared in maybe 15 or 20 different western TV shows.
Now look at your credits. Kind of goes back and forth between westerns and kind of science fiction.
Science fiction, westerns, yeah. In the westerns, I usually played bad guys, and sometimes Indians, and sometimes other characters, whatever. You know, often people who are in trouble of some kind. You know?
Now, obviously, the science fiction direction you would stay with that to a great extent, but kind of left the westerns behind.
Well, the westerns kind of faded away when science fiction became popular. In Star Trek, for example, instead of the Indians being the bad guys, it became the Klingons. I mean, that's a fact. The westerns kind of disappeared when science fiction became the frontier as opposed to the West.
Yeah.
So the westerns kind of gradually faded away.
The American frontier became the final frontier.
Yeah, exactly. I worked with Clint Eastwood on Rawhide many years ago. I did all those shows. Yeah.
Now, throughout these early years in your film career, did religion, did spirituality have any impact on you?
No, not that I recall. No, not that I recall. Much later, maybe. Oh golly, maybe 20 years ago, I produced and acted in a television movie, a 2-hour television movie called Never Forget, which was a story based on a true story, based on a man who lives in Southern California, who was taken into Auschwitz with his family during the Second World War, and lost his parents and siblings. Came out alone, and he was only about 17 or 18 when he came out alive, and. He eventually got into a battle with an organization of Holocaust deniers, people who were professionally distributing literature that said the Holocaust was a hoax. He got into a legal battle with them and finally won a case against them in Los Angeles Superior Court in 1979. So about 20 years ago, I did a TV movie about him. That's the closest I think I've come to dealing with any of these religious or even secular Jewish issues.
Since we're here, and since we're on the subject of religion, tell me where the hand gesture that Spock came up with, you came up with for Spock, tell us where that came from. Explain that, if you would.
Okay, we've sort of been dancing around that issue in this conversation. You want to get to the nitty-gritty?
Well, I want to get there. I'll get to a couple of places anyway.
Okay. During the service that I mentioned earlier, when supposedly the Shekhina comes into the sanctuary to bless the congregation, there's a prayer where the priestly members of the priestly tribe of Hebrews bless the congregation with a prayer that we know in the English and in the Hebrew, the Old Testament and New Testament, as may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his countenance to shine upon you and grant you peace, and so forth. Well, in the service that my family attended when I was a kid, these gentlemen who did that prayer, who blessed the congregation with that prayer, used that gesture. Mm-hmm. They extended their hands like that over the congregation. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea what it was, but it intrigued me. And it was in that moment that my dad said, "Don't look." And everybody's got their eyes covered and they're all looking away. Well, I peeked. I was an 8-year-old kid who was curious, and I peeked and I saw that. So I started working on it. I thought, I wanted to master that, to be able to do that. And I just put it away in my head someplace. As I said, I didn't know why they were doing that, but I learned later that this is the shape of a Hebrew letter, a letter in the Hebrew alphabet called Shin. And the Shin is the first letter in the word Shaddai, which is the name for the Almighty, and it's also the first letter in the word Shekhina, which is the name of the feminine aspect of the Almighty. So the idea is that they're using a symbol of God's name when they bless the congregation with that. And we were doing an episode of Star Trek where my character, Spock, had to go back to his home planet of Vulcan. It was the first time we were going to Vulcan in the series. We'd never seen Vulcan before. We'd never seen any other Vulcan before. Mm-hmm. Spock was the only Vulcan we knew. And in the scene where Spock is to meet the lady who's going to officiate at his wedding, we needed some kind of a greeting between Vulcans, and I suggested that. Mm-hmm. And the director said, okay, and that's how I introduced it into Star Trek.
I noticed that you had done some photography of hands, and does the hand have some kind of a particular importance?
I guess.
No, I mean spiritually. I'm curious.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But I was intrigued with the idea that it was an interesting form of greeting. It was useful as a form of greeting. Mm-hmm. Hands can be terribly expressive. I have done some photography around the issue of hands. Mm-hmm. But it's not a major thread of my work. I've done a little bit of along that line. Mm-hmm. Some of it is on my website. But in that particular case, I was just intrigued with that usage, and I decided to introduce it into Star Trek.
And frankly, that wasn't where I was going. Where I was going when I asked you if spirituality had an impact on you in your film is, if you look at Star Trek 3 and 4, which you directed, particularly 3, it seems that there is a very, very much a spirituality to the character that you played. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that was intentional, if there were. I'm trying to get a picture of the whole Leonard Nimoy here and how these things tie together.
Not necessarily religious, but spiritual, yes. Spirituality is a word that we hear a lot, and I use it freely and maybe too freely. What does it really mean? To me, it means morality, it means ethics, it means living ethically, living a decent life, treating people decently, caring about what happens to somebody beside yourself, being aware that you're not alone on this planet, and it's not everything is about you, that there are reasons to take other people into consideration and other issues to take into consideration beside your own daily responsibilities and your own career and your own needs and desires. It just means living a full life as a considerate human being. That's what I consider being a spiritual person. It doesn't necessarily mean, I know people who don't believe in God, but I consider them spiritual people. Mm-hmm. So I think spirituality is something that's not necessarily religious. It can be, of course, but not necessarily religious.
Do you go to synagogue regularly these days?
No, not regularly. We go on the high holidays. Our rabbi happens to be my wife's cousin. We think a lot of him. He runs a very good congregation. And one of the reasons we think a lot of him, think highly of him, is because his bent, his orientation is towards the community. Mm-hmm. It's not about, are you a good Jew, or are you a bad person, or are you evil, or are you sinning, or any of that kind of thing. It's about being a useful part of the community. Mm-hmm. It's about helping in the community, making a positive impact in the community, and we believe in that.
There's really just one last thing I want to ask you that has particularly to do with our valley and your work at Vasquez Rocks. And I had heard, well, the episode of the original Star Trek, The Arena, where Captain Kirk battles this green lizard called the Gorn,
Yeah,
which
that
was
might have
played
been
by
Vasquez.
Bobby Clark,
Was
who
that at
lives here in
Vasquez
the
Rocks?
Santa Clarita Valley. Yeah, that was here at
could be,
Vasquez
yeah,
Rocks.
yeah.
I had heard that you had gotten too close to an explosion that went off or something. And that something
Bill and
happened there.
I did have an experience. It might have been on the Arena.
Supposedly it was on
I don't
that
remember which
episode.
episode.
Okay.
But we were, but it was not an exterior moment. We were on a sound stage when it happened. There was an explosion that went off camera, and typically, when there's an explosion, I mean a planned explosion in a scene in a movie, they will open the soundstage doors so the concussion has someplace to go. It can go outside the doors.
Okay.
Well, they had failed to open the doors, so there was a big concussion within the building, and we were close to it, Bill and I. And since then, Bill and I both have a ringing in our ears, which is called tinnitus. And we believe it was caused by that particular experience. It might have been on that episode, but it was not at Vasquez Rocks.
Okay.
It was inside.
I didn't want to think that we here in the Santa Clarita Valley had a
You're not
negative
responsible.
impact on you.
No, you're not responsible.
Okay. Well, good.
You're off the hook.
What's your connection here to Congregation Beth Shalom? Why here?
Adam Mallon, who's a member of this congregation, is a good friend of mine. We've been working together at Galley for maybe 30 years. He's a convention producer, and he's produced an enormous number of very successful Star Trek conventions that I've appeared in, and so has Bill Shatner and all the other Star Trek people. So he asked me if I would come out and do this.
Great.
And I'm here for that reason.
I guess we'll find out what their reception is to your book.
Okay. If I get into trouble, help me out, will you?
All right, you got it. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for
My
joining
pleasure.
us.
Thank you.
If you missed any portion of this program, you can read a transcript in the Sunday Signal. Check back here, SCV TV Channel 20, Wednesday 9:30 p.m., Sunday 8:30 a.m. for another Newsmaker of the Week.